Look, they all vary a little bit, but they're all kind of similar. Some freedom at 70, nearly all at 80, and sort of, well, New South Wales, basically everything, including unvaccinated, at 90. It's essentially, mostly in keeping with that national roadmap, given there were a lot of grey areas and sort of to be determined, and it's up to the states within the national roadmap.
Indeed. Good afternoon to you, Tom. Yes, look, there's been a bit of overstating and understating of what the roadmap based on the Dohery modelling actually came to. But yes, I think you're pretty much right as far as New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT are concerned. They're pretty much in sync. The immediate changes in Victoria are not very much at all, really. Things like, personal training in a park, etc., etc. That really doesn't go to the substance of life. It may have something to do with the quality of life, and it's certainly going to be difficult for business. There's no doubt about that, as things slowly get back to what everyone hopes will be COVID normal by the end of the year. But there's obviously concern on the part of the New South Wales and Victorian governments about exactly whether their hospital capacity will be able to cope as we open up and as we get an inevitable surge in cases of COVID. That is clearly a matter that's worrying them. And I would think that if they don't want to do some fairly severe triaging of people, that is leaving emergency room doctors in a situation where they've got to make life and death choices as they do on the battlefronts, for example, that I can understand why the state governments would be pretty darn cautious about the way in which they do open up, hopefully, so that as the weather gets better and we get closer to Christmas, things do return to something like normal, not just for ordinary citizens, but for business too.
Yeah, absolutely. For business, for citizens, for school kids, all of the above, people stuck overseas. The states that are looking to be different at the moment, Queensland to some extent, WA clearly. What's interesting is, sure, states can do what they want. No one's saying they get forced. But if you look at the national roadmap, it's a strong suppression before we get to 70 and then 80%. After that, it's about minimising serious illness and hospitalisation. Now, you can say, well, if there's no COVID, we have nobody in hospital, sure, but it's clearly in this roadmap, it's not about COVID zero. For now, it looks like in Queensland and WA, they still want COVID zero well beyond 80% vaccination. That seems pretty obvious.
It certainly does, and it's interesting to note that Daniel Andrews, for example, has broken with his Labor colleagues to the extent that he's saying that getting to COVID zero is just not going to happen.
It was pretty blunt, wasn't it, from Andrews?
Oh, it was very, very straightforward, Tom. I think there's a bit of a difference between Western Australia and Queensland. I think in Western Australia, that's an economy that is going well, and unless the iron ore price really takes a tumble, will continue to do so, and it has shown an ability to get on quite okay without the rest of Australia. And knowing Western Australia as I do, having lived there in my teenage years, West Australians will give McGowan brownie points for the stand that he's taking. Queensland is a bit different. They don't much like people south of the Tweed. There's no doubt about that. Maroons and cockroaches, etc., etc. But it is slightly different. You have an economy that's quite dependent on tourism. Summer is a big period for that. There's also the question of the disaffection around the border on that, around the Tweed, on businesses on both sides of the border struggling. And now we've seen this case developing in Brisbane, right on the, well, not quite the eve, but very close to when we're supposed to get the NRL grand final. It'll be interesting to see whether it gets contained to such a point that they don't have to make a last-minute decision, that the grand final will have to be conducted without spectators. I think that's very much a question at the moment. So I think it's a bit different between Queensland and WA, and I don't think it does, by the way, Scott Morrison any good in terms of bashing Mark McGowan in particular, and it didn't help in the last state election in Queensland either to go after Anastasia Palaszczuk. Whether that shifted a bit in recent times, I'm not so sure, but it's a very tricky equation. There's no doubt about it. But in Southern Australia,
Yeah, I just think it's going to get tricky for Mark McGowan if everyone's opened up and everyone realises he's shut because the hospital system isn't coping. I mean, on Queensland as well, remember there are a lot of families that want to get back and have reunions. So I get what you're saying. There's the temperature now. I just do think this could switch quite quickly. I suppose we'll see. I did want to get you just quickly, though, Jim, on net zero. This is a pretty delicate mission for Scott Morrison. There is genuine global pressure on Australia. He has clearly indicated he wants to get towards this actual net zero commitment. And then there's managing the Nats. Barnaby Joyce is key to him here. We'll see to what extent Barnaby Joyce can control his own party room. If the old adage goes that it takes a conservative to convince someone of a progressive task, if you like, and if that will work for Barnaby Joyce.
It is a bit like Nixon in China. You're quite right. There is some aspects of that. The interesting thing, it seems to me, of what's going on in the National Party, it seems to me that Barnaby Joyce is using Keith Pitt, Matt Canavan to front-run the National Party's argument with Scott Morrison. He's enabled Matt Canavan and Keith Pitt, I should say, are saying the kinds of things that Barnaby can't because he wants to be able to be in a negotiating position. But they're shots across the Liberal Party's vows in general, Scott Morrison. It's such back from metropolitan Liberals, and quite an extraordinary thing I saw this morning in the Australian Financial Review, which is two cabinet ministers having a spat, Bridget McKenzie calling out Josh Frydenberg effectively by name about how easy she says it is for leafy green electorates in the centre of Australia's biggest cities to go for net zero rather than the country. Now, whatever happened, Tom, to cabinet solidarity? What a situation where you've got two cabinet ministers at each other, or at least one taking up arms against another and having a public dispute. This can only happen because effectively the government has no policy at the moment, and I think it's a very, very difficult balancing act for Scott Morrison. I'm not sure he's going to get there, and if he does, I'm not sure he's going to get to a position where urban Liberals are going to feel particularly comfortable with what Scott Morrison has given to the Nationals, where what we're effectively arguing about now is the price, not the if of committing to net zero.
For most people, I mean, there's some who are saying ye shall not pass, but I think reality will get them in the end. Jim, thank you as ever